Deep in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, where the black waters of the Rio Negro wind through ancient jungle, there exists a legend so terrifying that even the most hardened explorers whisper about it only in daylight. This is not a story of folklore passed down through generations. This is a documented account from the journals of European explorers who ventured into these uncharted waters in the mid-1800s. Men of science, cartographers, and adventurers who came seeking knowledge but found something that defied every natural law they understood. The year was 1846. A Portuguese-Brazilian expedition, led by naturalist Colonel Antonio Rodrigues, set out from Manaus with a singular purpose: to map the unexplored tributaries of the Rio Negro and catalog the wildlife of this mysterious region. Their flotilla consisted of 3 large canoes, 16 men, and enough supplies for a 3-month journey into the unknown. What they encountered would change their lives forever and leave a mark on exploration history that scholars still debate to this day. The expedition's first warning came not from their own observations, but from the indigenous people they encountered. As they paddled deeper into the tributary system, every village they stopped had shared the same haunting tale: a serpent of impossible size that ruled the deeper waters of the river. The Tacano people called it Moa Grande, the Great Worm. The Desana referred to it as Yakamuma, the Mother of the Waters. Different names, but always the same description: a snake so massive it could wrap around entire trees, with a body as thick as a full-grown man is tall. Colonel Rodrigues, a rational man trained in European scientific method, documented these accounts in his journal with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He wrote, "The natives speak with genuine fear of a creature they claim inhabits the deeper pools and bends of the river. While I am inclined to attribute such tales to the natural human tendency toward exaggeration, the consistency of these reports across different tribes who have no contact with one another is peculiar. They describe a serpent of dimensions that would make it the largest living reptile on Earth, larger than the anacondas we have already documented, which themselves reach lengths of 20 feet or more." The expedition continued upriver, and Rodrigues meticulously noted the wildlife they encountered: giant otters, black caimans, river dolphins, and yes, impressive anacondas, but nothing that approached the fantastic descriptions given by the villagers. The colonel's skepticism seemed justified. These were, after all, the same people who believed in shape-shifting jaguars and river spirits. Surely the serpent was just another myth, perhaps based on rare sightings of particularly large anacondas, magnified by fear and retelling. But on the 9th day of their journey, something changed. It was late afternoon, the time when the Amazon sun begins its rapid descent and the forest canopy glows with golden light. The expedition had just passed through a narrow channel where massive kapok trees leaned over the water, their roots creating natural archways. The river widened into a calm, dark pool, the kind of place where the water runs deep and still, where you cannot see the bottom even in bright sunlight. Rodrigues noticed it first. The birds had gone silent. Anyone who has spent time in a rainforest knows this is never a good sign. The constant chatter of parrots, the calls of howler monkeys, the buzz of insects, it all creates a symphony that becomes a background soundtrack of jungle life. When that symphony stops, it means something is wrong. Predators nearby, danger approaching, nature itself holding its breath. The colonel raised his hand, signaling the canoes to slow. The men ceased paddling, letting their vessels drift on the gentle current. In his journal, Rodrigues wrote, "An unnatural silence descended upon us. Even the water seemed to still. My men felt it too. I could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their eyes darted to the riverbanks and the water around us. Then they saw the wake. It came from behind them, a disturbance in the water that was moving against the current. At first, it looked like a long, submerged log, a common enough sight in these waters where fallen trees often float just beneath the surface. But logs do not move with purpose. Logs do not change direction. And logs certainly do not create a wake pattern that suggests something of enormous length undulating just below the waterline. "Serpent," whispered one of the Brazilian guides, a man named Joao who had lived on the Rio Negro his entire life. Serpent Grande, the thing, whatever it was, passed alongside the middle canoe, about 15 feet away. The men in that boat later reported that the disturbance in the water stretched longer than their entire vessel, which measured 22 feet from bow to stern. They caught glimpses of scales, dark and mottled, each one large in a man's hand. The water rippled and churned as the creature moved beneath them with a slow, powerful rhythm. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The wake dissipated. The water returned to its mirror-like calm, and after several long moments, the sounds of the jungle gradually resumed. Colonel Rodriguez ordered the expedition to make camp early that day. They found a rocky outcropping on the riverbank, a rare formation in this region of soft soil and tangled roots, a place where they could pull the canoes fully out of the water and establish a defensive perimeter. That night, as they sat around their fires, the European members of the expedition tried to rationalize what they had seen. "It must have been a very large anaconda," suggested Dr. Friedrich Schwartz, the German botanist accompanying the journey. "I have read account of specimens reaching 30 feet in length. Perhaps the water distorted our perception of its true size." But Joao, the guide, shook his head firmly. "I have seen anacondas all my life, senor. I have killed them, eaten them, been bitten by them. What we saw today was no anaconda. It was too long, too thick. The movement was wrong. Anacondas swim with their heads above water when they cross open river like that. This thing stayed below, like it didn't want to be fully seen." The indigenous porters sat apart from the main group, speaking quietly in their own languages. When Rodriguez approached them with his translator, they reluctantly shared what they knew. The Serpent, they said, was most active during the rainy season when the river ran high and flooded into the forest. It preferred the deeper channels and pools, places where the water turned black from tannins and depth. Some claimed it was as long as 6 or 7 canoes placed end to end. Others said it could crush a bull caiman in its coils or swallow a full-grown tapir without needing to dislocate its jaws. "How many people have seen this creature?" Rodriguez asked. The translator conferred with the porters, then replied, "They say many have seen it over the years, but those who see it up close, who encounter it when it is hunting or disturbed, those people do not usually return to tell their stories." The expedition continued upriver the following morning, though the atmosphere among the men had changed noticeably. The easy camaraderie and excitement of discovery had been replaced by vigilance and unease. They stayed closer. Together, the 3 canoes maintaining tighter formation, the men paddled with more deliberate care, trying to minimize splash and noise. For 2 days, nothing unusual occurred. They made good progress, documenting new species of plants, collecting specimens, and mapping the river's course. Rodriguez began to wonder if the encounter had been a one-time event, a chance crossing of paths with a remarkable but ultimately natural creature, an exceptionally large anaconda, nothing more. Then came the 3rd day after the initial sighting. They had entered a section of the river where the channel narrowed again, compressed between walls of dense vegetation. The water ran faster here, and the men had to work harder with their paddles to maintain control. Colonel Rodriguez was in the lead canoe, using his compass and sextant to record their position. When he felt rather than saw the change in the water, the current faltered. For just a moment, the river seemed to flow backward, as if something massive had displaced a huge volume of water just ahead of them. Then the lead canoe lurched violently to the left. "Something underneath!" shouted the helmsman. "Something is under the boat." Rodriguez grabbed the gunwales as the canoe tilted at a dangerous angle. Through the dark water, he glimpsed something pale and massive sliding beneath them. The underside of the creature, he realized, easily twice the width of their canoe. The Serpent was surfacing directly below them. "Paddle right. Right side hard," he commanded. The men on the right side of the canoe dug their paddles deep, straining to move the vessel away from whatever was rising beneath them. The canoe responded, sliding sideways just as an enormous coil broke the surface where they had been moments before. Now they could see it clearly. The Serpent's body rose from the water like a massive, living cable, dripping and glistening. Its scales were not the uniform color of any snake Rodriguez had seen before. They were mottled patterns of deep green, black, and muddy brown, perfect camouflage for the murky river water. Each scale was easily the size of a dinner plate. The coil that had breached the surface was, by Rodriguez's later estimation, at least 4 feet in diameter, as thick as a large man's torso. But what struck terror into the hearts of the explorers was a realization that this was only one coil, one section of the creature's body. The rest remained hidden beneath the dark water, and they had no idea how much more there was. "Back! Paddle back!" Rodriguez ordered, his scientific detachment momentarily overcome by survival instinct. The second and third canoes had already reversed course, their crews frantically paddling against the current to put distance between themselves and the massive serpent. The lead canoe followed suit, and for several agonizing minutes, the men worked their paddles with desperate strength, fighting both the current and their fear. The serpent's coil remained visible for a long moment, water streaming from its scales, before it slowly sank back beneath the surface. The creature did not pursue them. It simply submerged and vanished, leaving only ripples that spread across the water and slowly faded. The expedition pulled to shore a half-mile downstream, finding a small beach where they could land and regroup. Several of the men were shaking. One of the younger porters was praying loudly in Portuguese. Colonel Rodriguez, despite his own racing heart, immediately began documenting what they had witnessed. As a trained naturalist, he understood the importance of recording details while they remained fresh in memory. He interviewed each man separately, asking them to describe what they had seen, to estimate sizes and dimensions. He sketched the pattern of scales, the color variations, the shape of the coil as it had emerged from the water. Dr. Schwartz, the botanist, had a background in comparative anatomy. He sat with Rodriguez and performed calculations based on the visible diameter of the serpent's body. "If we assume a roughly cylindrical body shape, and we estimate the visible coil at approximately 4 feet in diameter," Schwartz said, working to mathematics, "and if we further assume this represents the thickest portion of the animal's body, typically the middle section in snakes, then we can extrapolate a possible total length." "And what do your calculations suggest?" Rodriguez asked. Schwartz looked up from his notes, his face pale. "Based on proportions of known giant snakes, and being extremely conservative in our estimates, I believe we encountered a serpent no less than 60 feet in length, more probably 70 to 80 feet, perhaps even longer." The two scientists sat in silence, contemplating the implications. The largest anaconda ever reliably measured was just over 27 feet long. The reticulated pythons of Southeast Asia reached similar lengths. But what they were suggesting, a snake 3 times that size, it would rewrite every zoological text ever published. "No one will believe us," Rodriguez said finally. "We need proof, physical evidence." The indigenous guides overheard this conversation, and Joao approached them with a grave expression. "Colonel, I must speak plainly. To hunt this creature would be madness. We barely escaped with our lives. It showed restraint today. It could have easily overturned our canoes if it wished. I believe it was merely warning us away from its territory. I am not suggesting we hunt it," Rodriguez clarified. "But if we could find evidence of its existence, shed skin, perhaps ore tracks in a riverbank, or even another clear sighting where we can take more detailed measurements and drawings, then we would have something tangible to bring back to the scientific community." After much debate, the expedition reached a compromise. They would continue their journey, but they would move more cautiously and be prepared to document any further encounters. If the opportunity arose to collect physical evidence without endangering the men, they would take it. What Colonel Rodriguez didn't fully understand was that his decision to continue had changed the dynamic between the expedition and the serpent. Over the following days, it became increasingly clear that the creature was not only aware of their presence, it was following them. The first sign came that very night. The expedition had made camp on a bend in the river, posting watches in rotation, as was their standard practice. Around midnight, the men on watch reported seeing something large moving in the water just beyond the edge of their firelight. They could not see it clearly, but they could hear it. The sound of water displacing around something of great bulk, the softest of scales sliding over submerged logs. The creature circled their camp for nearly an hour before finally moving on. The next day, as they continued upriver, they began finding signs of the serpent's passage. In one location, they discovered where something massive had hauled itself partially onto the muddy riverbank. The trail it left was as wide as a man was tall, a smooth channel through the mud where vegetation had been flattened and pushed aside. Following this trail inland for a short distance, They found a small clearing where several large trees showed recent damage, bark scraped away at heights of 15 to 20 feet, as if somebody had used the trees to support its weight while moving. Through the forest, it can travel on land, Dr. Schwartz observed, his voice quiet with awe. It is not purely aquatic. This was perhaps the most unsettling revelation yet. The rivers of the Amazon provided at least some sense of boundaries, of predictability. But if the creature could move through the flooded forest as easily as it moved through water, then there was no true escape from it. Joao examined the trail with the expertise of a man who had tracked animals his entire life. This is recent, maybe from early this morning before dawn. And see here, he pointed to where the trail crossed over itself. It came from the river, moved into the forest, then returned to the river, like it was watching our camp from the jungle while we slept. The implications hung heavy in the humid air. The serpent had been on land, near their camp, while they slept. Over the next 3 days, the encounters intensified. The expedition would catch glimpses of the creature as they traveled, a massive coil breaking the surface in the distance, a wake moving parallel to their course, the distinctive disturbance in the water that they had learned to recognize. Always it maintained a certain distance, never attacking, but never fully leaving them alone either. Rodriguez documented everything meticulously. He noted times, locations, behaviors, water conditions. He sketched repeatedly, trying to capture the exact pattern of the scales, the proportion of the body, the way it moved through water. His journal entries became increasingly detailed and increasingly concerned. Day 14 of expedition. The creature continues to shadow our progress. I can no longer dismiss this as coincidence or chance encounters. It is deliberately following us, though for what purpose I cannot determine. Is it curious? Territorial? Hunting? The indigenous guides are increasingly agitated and have begun to speak of turning back. On the 15th day, Colonel Rodriguez called a meeting of the expedition's leadership. The situation had become untenable. They were still several weeks from their planned turnaround point, but the constant presence of the serpent was taking a psychological toll on the men. Several of the porters had already approached Joao, demanding that they abandon the journey and return to Manaus. "We are scientists and explorers," Rodriguez argued. "We came here to document the unknown, and we have found something truly extraordinary. If we turn back now, we will have only incomplete observations, fragmentary evidence. We need more data, more detailed documentation." But Dr. Schwartz, who had been Rodriguez's strongest ally in the scientific pursuit, now counseled caution. "Antonio, I understand your enthusiasm, and I share it. But we must also consider the safety of the men. This creature has shown remarkable persistence in following us. What if its behavior changes? What if it decides we are prey rather than merely intruders?" The decision was made to compromise once again. They would not turn back immediately, but they would modify their route to avoid the deepest channels where the serpent seemed to prefer hunting. They would travel more during daylight hours and make camp in locations that offered better defensive positions, islands or high banks where the creature could not easily approach unseen. For 2 days, this strategy seemed to work. They saw no sign of the serpent. The men began to relax slightly, to hope that perhaps they had finally moved beyond its territory. They were wrong. It happened on a stretch of river where the Rio Negro split around a series of low islands covered in dense vegetation. The expedition chose the left channel, which appeared deeper and more navigable. The 3 canoes moved in single file through water that had turned almost black, stained by tannins from decaying vegetation. They were halfway through the passage when the attack came. The lead canoe, carrying Colonel Rodriguez and 5 other men, suddenly rose in the water as something massive surfaced directly beneath it. For a moment, the vessel was balanced on the serpent's back, tilted at a 45-degree angle, water and equipment sliding toward the stern. Then, with shocking violence, the creature rolled. The maneuver was deliberate and devastatingly effective. As the serpent rotated its body, the canoe flipped completely, dumping all 6 men into black water. Supplies scattered across the surface, journals, equipment, specimen boxes, while the men struggled to stay afloat and reach the capsized vessel. From the second canoe, Joao reacted with the split-second instincts of an experienced river guide. To the bank. Get to the bank, he shouted, steering his vessel toward the nearest island while the crew paddled with desperate strength. The third canoe followed suit. In the water, Rodriguez surfaced gasping. His first thought was for his journals, months of careful documentation, now floating away or sinking into the dark river. His second thought was for his men. He could see four of them clinging to the overturned canoe. The sixth man, a porter named Vicente, was several meters away, swimming toward them. Then Rodriguez saw the wake. It was moving toward Vicente with terrifying speed, a straight line cutting through the water. Swim. Vicente, swim faster, he shouted. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was futile. What happened next occurred in seconds, but would remain burned into Rodriguez's memory for the rest of his life. The wake reached Vicente, and then the man simply vanished beneath the surface. No thrashing, no struggle, no chance to scream. One moment he was there, swimming. The next he was gone, pulled under by something moving with irresistible force. The water where Vicente had disappeared erupted in violent turbulence. For a brief, horrible moment, they glimpsed the serpent's massive coils breaking the surface as it wrapped around its prey. The size was staggering. Coils as thick as ancient tree trunks, length beyond measure, power beyond comprehension. Then it sounded, diving deep, and Vicente was gone. Joao and the crew of the second canoe showed remarkable courage in what followed. Rather than fleeing to safety, they steered back toward the overturned canoe where Rodriguez and the other men clung to the slippery hull. The third canoe provided cover, its crew armed with rifles and harpoons, scanning the water for any sign of the serpent's return. "Take them on. Quick, before it comes back," Joao commanded, maneuvering his canoe alongside the survivors. Hands reached down, pulling the waterlogged men aboard one by one. Rodriguez came last, reluctant to abandon his overturned vessel and all the documentation it still contained. The journals, he gasped as they hauled him into canoe. "We must save the journals." "Later, Colonel. We must leave now," Joao insisted. But even as he spoke, several men were already retrieving floating items from the water. Bags, boxes, and yes, several of Rodriguez's leather-bound journals that had managed to stay afloat due to their waterproof wrappings. They retrieved what they could in the 30 seconds they dared to linger. Then the canoes turned and paddled with frantic speed toward the island. Every man expected at any moment to feel the vessel lurch upward, to be thrown into the water as the first canoe had been. Every eye scanned the dark water for the telltale wake. But the serpent did not return. It had taken its prey and retreated to the depths to consume its meal. The expedition made camp on the island, a small patch of high ground barely large enough for all of them to crowd together. They pulled the canoes completely out of the water and posted guards on all sides, though everyone knew that if the creature decided to attack them here, there was little they could do to prevent it. Vicente's death hung over the camp like a shroud. He had been a young man, barely 20 years old, strong and eager, with a wife and infant daughter waiting for him back in Manaus. Now he was gone, taken by a creature that most of the world would dismiss as myth or madness. Colonel Rodriguez sat apart from the others, his recovered journals spread before him on a tarp. The waterproof leather cases had done their job. Most of his documentation had survived, though some pages were water-damaged and others had been lost entirely in the chaos. He stared at his sketches of the serpent, his careful measurements and observations, and felt a crushing weight of responsibility. "This is my fault," he said quietly when Dr. Schwartz joined him. "I insisted we continue. I put scientific curiosity above the safety of the men." Schwartz was silent for a moment, then replied, "Vicente knew the risks. Every man on this expedition understood we were venturing into unknown territory, facing unknown dangers. You cannot bear all the responsibility for tragedy, Antonio." "Can I?" Rodriguez gestured at his journals. "What is all of this worth? Documentation of a creature the scientific world will never believe exists? Sketches and measurements that will be dismissed as the hallucinations of men driven mad by the jungle? One man is dead, Friedrich. Dead so that I could collect data that may be worthless." The botanist had no answer to that. They remained on the island through the night and into the next day, hoping the serpent would lose interest and move on. But by mid-afternoon, it became clear they could not stay indefinitely. Their food supplies were limited, and the small island offered no fresh water source. Joao proposed a plan. We must move quickly and stay in the shallowest water we can navigate. The creature is too large to follow us into the channels where the river spreads wide and runs thin. If we can reach the Varzea, the seasonally flooded forest, we can travel through water too shallow for it. It was risky, but they had few alternatives. They redistributed the remaining supplies between the two functioning canoes, abandoning non-essential equipment to make the vessels as light and maneuverable as possible. The overturned canoe was beyond recovery without proper time and tools, so they left it on the island. What followed was a nightmare journey that lasted 4 days and would later be described by Rodriguez as a pursuit across hell itself. They entered the Varzea, a labyrinth of flooded forest, where trees rose from water that varied from a few inches to several feet deep. The canoes had to be paddled, pushed, and sometimes dragged through this maze, the men wading through murky water, never knowing what they might step on or what might be lurking beneath the surface. And through it all, the serpent followed. It could not enter the shallowest areas, but wherever the water deepened even slightly, they would see the wake, hear the soft displacement of water around massive bulk. The creature was hunting them now, no longer merely observing. It had tasted human flesh, and it wanted more. On the second day in the Varzea, they heard it moving through the forest parallel to their position. The sound was like nothing the men had ever experienced. The enormous bulk of the creature sliding through flooded undergrowth, pushing aside trees, crushing vegetation. They would catch glimpses through the vegetation. Massive coils, scales glinting with water, eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light beneath the canopy. Joao led them deeper into the maze, choosing routes that took them to the absolute shallowest water available. Sometimes they were wading through water barely ankle-deep, dragging the canoes behind them. The work was exhausting. The heat was oppressive, and the psychological strain of being hunted by an apex predator of unprecedented size was pushing several men to the breaking point. Rodriguez continued to document everything. Even in these desperate circumstances, even as they ran for their lives, his scientific training compelled him to observe and record. He noted how the serpent moved through the flooded forest, how it used the tree trunks for leverage, how it could somehow sense their location even when they were out of sight. He sketched its trail through the mud and broken vegetation, took measurements of trees that had been pushed aside or knocked down by its passage. The creature exhibits remarkable intelligence, he wrote in his journal during a brief rest period. It has learned our patterns, anticipated our routes. It positions itself at the deeper channels, waiting for us to be forced into water where it can attack. This is not the behavior of a simple reptile operating on instinct alone. This is an apex predator with cognitive abilities that allow it to problem solve and plan. On the 4th day in the Varzea, they reached a point where geography gave them no choice. Ahead, the flooded forest opened into a wide, deep channel, at least 200 meters across, with water deep enough to easily accommodate the serpent. There was no way around it. They would have to cross. Joao studied the crossing, calculating angles and distances. We moved together, both canoes side by side. We paddle as fast as possible. Do not stop for anything. If it attacks one canoe, the other must keep going and reach the far shore. Understood. The men understood. They also understood what Joao was really saying. If the serpent attacked, some of them would die, so that others could escape. It was brutal calculus, but it was their only chance. The two canoes pushed off in the shallow water into the deeper channel, the men paddling in synchronized rhythm, every muscle strained, every sense was heightened to painful acuity. The shore they were aiming for seemed impossibly distant, though in reality it was only a few minutes of hard paddling away. They made it halfway across before the serpent appeared. It came from behind and beneath, rising from the depths like a submarine surfacing. The water in front of them bulged upward as the massive coils broke through, and suddenly the creature's head emerged for the first time. Until this moment, despite all their encounters, they had never seen the serpent's head. Now, as it rose from the black water, they understood why the indigenous people spoke of it with such terror. The head was enormous, wider than a man's torso, covered in the same mottled scales that armored its body. But it was the eyes that paralyzed them, large, intelligent, and utterly alien. Not the blank, instinct-driven eyes of a common snake, but something that seemed aware, calculating, malevolent. The mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth designed for gripping prey and pulling it underwater, and a forked tongue, thick as a man's wrist, flickered out to taste the air. For a frozen moment, man and serpent regarded each other across 10 meters of open water. Then Joao's voice shattered the paralysis. "Paddle!" The canoes lurched forward as the men dug their paddles deep, driven by pure survival. Instinct. The serpent's head tracked their movement. Then it began to swim toward them with devastating speed. Its massive body undulated just beneath the surface, creating a wave that pushed toward the fleeing canoes. Faster. It's gaining. Dr. Schwartz shouted, abandoning his usual composure. The serpent closed the distance with terrifying efficiency. Its head drew alongside the rearmost canoe, and for a moment it seemed certain it would overturn them as it had done before. But then something unexpected happened. One of the men in that canoe, a Brazilian named Paulo who had said little throughout the entire expedition, stood up despite the dangerous instability this created. In his hands he held one of their whaling harpoons, a weapon designed for much smaller prey, but the largest implement they had. As the serpent's head came within range, Paulo threw the harpoon with all his strength. The weapon struck the creature just behind its head, the sharp point penetrating between scales into flesh. It was a tiny wound on such an enormous animal, no more significant than to be sting to a human, but the serpent's reaction was immediate and violent. The creature's entire body convulsed. Its head whipped back, nearly striking the canoe. The water erupted in chaos as the serpent rolled and thrashed, perhaps more from surprise and indignation than from actual pain. In those crucial seconds, the canoes gained precious distance. To the shore. "Don't stop," Joao commanded, and the men paddled with every last reserve of strength they possessed. Behind them, the serpent recovered from its surprise and resumed the chase, but the delay had cost it the advantage. The canoes reached the shallow water near the far shore just as the creature caught up. Its massive body drove forward into water too shallow to fully support its weight, momentum carrying it into the muddy shallows. The men abandoned the canoes and ran through ankle-deep water toward dry land. Behind them, the serpent was temporarily trapped in the shallows, its great bulk creating a bow wave as it struggled to maneuver in insufficient depth. They reached the bank, climbed up onto dry ground, and finally, they were in territory where the creature could not easily follow. The great snake remained in the shallows for several minutes, its head raised above the water, watching them. Rodriguez, even in his exhausted state, grabbed his journal and sketched frantically, knowing this might be his only chance to document the creature's head in detail. Then, slowly, the serpent began to retreat. It backed into deeper water, its movements deliberate and somehow dignified despite the awkwardness of the shallow depth. As they watched, it turned and swam away, diving beneath the surface until only the wake remained, and then even that disappeared. It did not return. The expedition made camp on the high bank and, for the first time in days, felt something approaching safety. They were battered, exhausted, traumatized by Vicente's death in the relentless pursuit, but they had survived. That night, as they sat around their fire, the men spoke quietly of what they had experienced. The indigenous porters expressed their belief that the serpent had finally allowed them to leave its territory. "It made its point," one of them said to the translator. "It showed us its power, took one of us as payment for intruding, and now it lets the rest go. This is how the great spirits of the river operate." Colonel Rodriguez was not sure he believed in spirits, but he could not deny that the serpent's final withdrawal had seemed almost purposeful, as if the creature had made a decision, exercised judgment. He spent much of that night reviewing his journals, inventorying what documentation had survived. He had detailed written observations, dozens of sketches, measurements, and testimony from multiple witnesses. It was, by any scientific standard, compelling evidence. But would it be enough to convince the skeptics back in Europe? Would learned men in comfortable universities believe that something so enormous, so outside the bounds of known biology, could exist? I will spend the rest of my life defending this truth, Rodriguez wrote in his journal that night. I will face ridicule and dismissal, will be called a fraud or a madman. But I know what I saw. We all know what we saw. Somewhere in the depths of the Rio Negro, there lives a creature that science has not yet acknowledged. And one day, perhaps long after I am gone, others will find the proof that I cannot capture. The return journey to Manaus took 3 weeks. The expedition followed a different route than their outbound journey, staying to major channels and avoiding the deep, mysterious waters where the Serpent ruled. They encountered no further sign of the creature, and as the days passed and they drew closer to civilization, the terror of their experience began to be replaced by a different emotion, a strange sense of awe, even privilege. They had witnessed something unknown to science, had survived an encounter with a creature that existed in the space between myth and reality. For all the trauma, for all the danger, there was something profound about that experience. Colonel Rodriguez used a journey to conduct extensive interviews with every member of the expedition. He recorded their individual observations, had them describe the serpent's appearance and behavior in their own words, documented their estimates of its size. The consistency of their accounts was remarkable. Across education levels, cultural backgrounds, and language barriers, the men described essentially the same creature. Dr. Schwartz, meanwhile, worked on comparative anatomical studies. Using the measurements and observations they had collected, he created detailed analysis comparing the serpent to known species of large snakes. His conclusion was unequivocal. The creature we encounter represents either an unknown species of gigantic proportions or a known species exhibiting unprecedented size. Given the significant morphological differences we observed, particularly in head shape, scale pattern, and behavioral characteristics, I believe we are dealing with a species unknown to science. When they finally arrived in Manaus, the expedition was met with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Vicente's widow received the devastating news of her husband's death with quiet dignity, though her grief was palpable. Rodriguez personally delivered what remained of Vicente's pay plus an additional sum from his own pocket, though he knew no amount of money could compensate for her loss. News of the expedition's claim spread quickly through Manaus and via ship and telegraph to the wider world. Initial reactions were largely skeptical, though the consistency of the accounts from multiple witnesses gave some observers pause. The local Portuguese and Brazilian authorities took the report seriously enough to organize a follow-up expedition to search for physical evidence of the creature. Rodriguez was invited to join, but he declined. The psychological scars of the first journey were still too fresh. Instead, he provided detailed maps of where they had encountered the serpent, descriptions of its apparent territory and behavior patterns. The second expedition spent 6 weeks searching the Rio Negro and its tributaries. They found some intriguing evidence, anomalously large trails in riverbank mud, reports from indigenous people of recent sightings, but they did not encounter the creature itself. Whether it had moved to a different territory, or simply was expert at avoiding detection, or perhaps had never been as large as reported, became a matter of intense debate. The expedition's failure to produce definitive proof unfortunately provided ammunition to skeptics who were already inclined to dismiss Rodriguez's account. When Colonel Rodriguez presented his findings to the Royal Geographical Society in London the following year, the reception was decidedly mixed. His journals, sketches, and the corroborating testimony of Dr. Schwartz and the other expedition members were impressive as documentation, but they lacked the one thing that Victorian science demanded: physical proof. Mr. Rodriguez, one prominent naturalist challenged during the presentation, you ask us to believe in a snake 2 to 3 times larger than any specimen ever documented. You provide drawings and measurements, but no bones, no skin, no photographs. How are we to accept such extraordinary claims on testimonial evidence alone? Rodriguez had anticipated this objection. I would ask you to consider, sir, that the anacondas of South America were themselves dismissed as exaggeration and myth until specimens were brought back to Europe. The gorilla was considered a fantasy until the mid-century. Our own contemporary, Dr. Alfred Russel Wallace, has documented cases where indigenous people had knowledge of species that European science denied existed until physical proof eventually validated their claims. The absence of a specimen does not equal the absence of the creature. The debate continued for hours. Some scientists were intrigued by the documentation and called for further expeditions. Others were dismissive, suggesting the expedition had encountered a large but not unprecedented anaconda, and that fear and the difficult circumstances had led to exaggerated perceptions of its size. The most cutting criticism came from those who suggested that Rodriguez and his men had fabricated the entire account to gain fame. This accusation wounded Rodriguez deeply, particularly the implicit suggestion that he would dishonor Vicente's memory by inventing the circumstances of his death. Despite the controversy, Rodriguez's account did have several lasting impacts. It brought renewed attention to the Amazon basin and the possibility that large, undiscovered species might exist in its vast, unexplored territories. Several subsequent expeditions were partly inspired by his journals, even if they officially claimed to be pursuing other goals. More importantly, Rodriguez's meticulous documentation became a model for how to record encounters with unknown creatures. His insistence on multiple witness accounts, detailed measurements, behavioral observations, and environmental context set a standard that later cryptozoologists would attempt to follow. The journals themselves became minor historical artifacts, housed eventually in the archives of the Museu Goeldi in Belém, Brazil. Researchers who have examined them note the obvious care and professionalism in Rodriguez's documentation, as well as the emotional toll evident in entries written during and after the pursuit. Colonel Antonio Rodriguez never returned to the Rio Negro. He continued his career as a naturalist and explorer, but he focused his work on regions that had already been relatively well documented. Some interpreted this as evidence that his Amazon account had been fabricated. Why would he not return to prove his claims? Those who knew him personally understood differently. Rodriguez had been genuinely traumatized by Vicente's death and the responsibility he felt for it. He had also become philosophical about the limits of human knowledge and the hubris of believing that science had cataloged all of Earth's creatures. In his later writings, Rodriguez expressed a different perspective on his famous encounter. Perhaps it is best that some mysteries remain mysteries. The serpent of the Rio Negro, if it still lives, deserves its privacy and its kingdom. We intruded upon its domain, and we paid a price for that intrusion. Let it remain in the depths, unknown and undisturbed. The world is lesser when all its wonders are cataloged and classified. What often gets overlooked in the historical debate about Rodriguez's expedition is the perspective of the indigenous peoples of the Rio Negro region. For them, the existence of the giant serpent was never in question. It was part of their understanding of the natural world, woven into their oral histories and cultural practices. The Tacano people, in particular, had detailed traditions regarding the creature they called Moi Grande. According to their cosmology, the serpent was ancient, not just old in years, but old in the sense of being primordial, a remnant of an earlier age of the world. It was said to emerge fully only during certain seasons, when the river ran highest and the boundaries between water and land became blurred. In Tacano tradition, the great serpent was not simply a predator, but a guardian of the deeper waters, a force that enforced respect for the river. Those who used the river respectfully, who took only what they needed and honored the water spirits, would pass safely. Those who came with greed or disrespect would face the serpent's wrath. Joao, the expedition guide who had shown such bravery during the encounters, shared some of these beliefs in the months after the expedition. In an interview documented by a Brazilian journalist, he explained, "The colonel and his men, they came with good intentions, but without proper understanding. They did not perform the ceremonies, did not ask permission from the river spirits. And when they encountered Moi Grande, instead of retreating respectfully, they sought to capture evidence, to treat it as a specimen. The serpent responded as any powerful being would when disrespected." Joao did not mean this as criticism of Rodriguez, whom he respected greatly. Rather, he was explaining a different framework for understanding the encounter, one in which the tragedy was not random predation, but a consequence of cultural misunderstanding and violated protocol. In the decades following Rodriguez's expedition, reports of the giant serpent continued to emerge from the Rio Negro region, though none were documented with the same scientific rigor. In 1867, a rubber tapper named Carlos Mendez reported seeing an enormous snake basking on a riverbank. By his account, the creature was so large that he initially mistook it for a fallen log until it began to move. Mendez watched from a safe distance as the Serpent, disturbed by his approach, slid into the water with a grace that seemed impossible for something of such size. In 1891, a small steamship traveling up the Rio Negro reported hitting what the crew initially believed was a submerged log. However, when the object began to move beneath the hull, pushing the ship to one side, they realized they had struck something alive. The first mate described seeing coils as thick as barrels sliding past the ship's side before the creature submerged and disappeared. Perhaps most intriguingly, in 1903, a French naturalist named Claude Dubois claimed to have found what he believed was a shed skin from an enormous snake. The skin fragment, which measured over 8 feet long and 18 inches wide, was unfortunately damaged during transport back to Europe and never properly analyzed. Dubois's photographs of the skin show scale patterns consistent with anacondas, but at a size that would suggest an animal of unprecedented proportions. None of these subsequent reports provided the definitive proof that skeptics demanded, but they did create a persistent pattern of sightings that kept the legend alive. Over the years, various scientific explanations have been proposed for the Rodriguez expedition's encounter. Some skeptics maintain that the expedition encountered a large but not unprecedented anaconda, and that the difficult circumstances, fear, and the distorting effects of water led to exaggerated size estimates. However, this theory struggles to explain the consistency of the size descriptions across multiple trained observers, including the scientifically minded Rodriguez and Schwartz. More imaginative theorists have suggested the Serpent might be a surviving specimen of Titanoboa, a genus of enormous snakes that lived approximately 60 million years ago during the Paleocene epoch. Fossil evidence indicates Titanoboa could reach lengths of 42 feet and weigh over a ton. While the scientific consensus is that Titanoboa has been extinct for millions of years, the Rio Negro's remote and relatively unexplored territories have led some to speculate about the possibility of relict populations of prehistoric species. The most scientifically defensible explanation is that the Rio Negro serpent, if it exists, represents an undiscovered species of large aquatic snake. The Amazon basin is vast and still incompletely explored. New species are discovered regularly, including large vertebrates. The discovery of a snake species significantly larger than known anacondas, while surprising, would not be unprecedented in terms of how biological science has had to repeatedly adjust its understanding of size limits in various species. Some biologists have proposed that if the creature exists, it might not be a true snake at all, but rather a large aquatic reptile that has evolved a serpentine body plan through convergent evolution. This would explain some of the morphological differences that Rodriguez documented between the creature and known snake species. Regardless of its zoological reality, the giant serpent of the Rio Negro has left an indelible mark on the cultural landscape of the Amazon region. It has become a symbol of the unknown depths of the rainforest, a reminder that for all of humanity's technological advancement, there remain places on Earth that guard their secrets. Local tourism in the Rio Negro region has, in recent decades, begun to embrace the legend. Tour operators offer expeditions to search for the giant serpent, though these are generally understood to be more about adventure tourism than serious cryptozoology. Still, the occasional report from tourists or local fishermen of unusual sightings keeps the legend alive. The serpent has also appeared in numerous works of fiction, documentaries, and popular media, usually portrayed as either a monster to be feared or a majestic creature deserving of respect and protection. These portrayals, while often sensationalized, have helped to raise broader awareness of the Amazon ecosystem and the importance of preserving it. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, with the advent of more sophisticated technology, several attempts have been made to investigate the legend of the Rio Negro serpent using modern tools. In 1997, a team of cryptozoologists equipped with underwater cameras, sonar equipment, and even a small remote-operated vehicle, ROV, spent 2 months exploring the deeper channels of the Rio Negro. They documented several interesting anomalies on sonar, large objects moving underwater at depths of 40 to 60 feet, but were unable to obtain clear visual confirmation. The black water of the Rio Negro, with its extremely low visibility, proved to be a significant obstacle to underwater photography. A 2008 expedition took a different approach, using environmental DNA, EDNA, sampling. This technique, involves collecting water samples and analyzing them for traces of DNA shed by animals living in the ecosystem. The expedition collected hundreds of samples from various points along the Rio Negro and its tributaries. While they identified DNA from numerous known species, including several types of anacondas, they did find some DNA sequences that they were unable to match to any known species. However, this could indicate any number of undiscovered organisms, not necessarily a giant serpent, and the researchers were appropriately cautious in their conclusions. Most recently, in 2019, a Brazilian-American research team used satellite imagery and AI analysis to search for anomalies in the river system that might indicate the presence of an unusually large aquatic animal. They identified several locations where vegetation patterns and riverbank disturbances suggested something of significant size had recently moved through the area. However, these patterns could also be explained by seasonal flooding, fallen trees, or known large animals like tapirs or caimans. None of these modern investigations has provided conclusive proof of the serpent's existence, but neither have they definitively disproven it. The Rio Negro and its surrounding ecosystem remain vast, dark, and incompletely understood. From a biological standpoint, could a snake of the size described by Rodriguez actually exist in the Rio Negro ecosystem? Reptile biologists point to several factors that would need to be considered. A snake of 60 to 80 feet in length would require enormous caloric intake. However, large snakes are incredibly efficient, with slow metabolisms that allow them to survive on relatively infrequent meals. An anaconda can go months between feedings after consuming a large prey animal. A giant serpent feeding on creatures like caimans, capybaras, or even river dolphins might be able to sustain itself in a prey-rich environment like the Amazon. Reptiles are ectothermic and need appropriate environmental temperatures. The consistently warm, tropical climate of the Amazon would actually be ideal for a large snake. Unlike temperate regions where snakes must hibernate, a tropical giant could remain active year-round. One challenge for any extremely large snake would be oxygen delivery to tissues. However, snakes have extremely efficient respiratory systems, and aquatic or semi-aquatic species are particularly well adapted to managing oxygen in challenging environments. For a viable breeding population to exist, there would need to be multiple individuals. This raises questions about why sightings are so rare. However, if the species is truly adapted to deep water and is primarily active during specific seasons or times of day, a small population could theoretically remain largely undetected. The scientific consensus is that while a snake of this size would be extraordinary, it is not biologically impossible. The Amazon ecosystem is productive enough to potentially support such a creature, and the environmental conditions are appropriate. As we stand in 2025, nearly 180 years after Colonel Rodriguez's fateful expedition, the question remains unanswered. Does a giant serpent of the Rio Negro exist? The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. We have detailed historical accounts from credible observers. We have consistent indigenous traditions spanning centuries. We have occasional modern sightings that, while not scientifically documented, come from reliable sources with no apparent motive to fabricate. We have environmental conditions that could plausibly support such a creature. But we lack the one thing that modern science requires: a specimen or, at minimum, indisputable physical evidence. Some researchers argue that this is precisely what we should expect from a truly rare, elusive creature in one of the most inaccessible environments on Earth. After all, the Amazon basin covers over 2.7 million square miles, much of it virtually unexplored. The Rio Negro alone has countless side channels, deep pools, and submerged caves that have never been investigated. If a small population of giant serpents exists, preferring the deepest, darkest, most remote waters, avoiding contact with humans, they could indeed remain hidden. Others counter that in the modern age, with satellite imagery, drone technology, Edna sampling, and millions of people living in and around the Amazon, it is increasingly unlikely that a creature of such size could remain completely unknown to science. They suggest that while the historical accounts may have been genuine encounters with large anacondas, the size has been exaggerated through the lens of fear and time. Perhaps Colonel Rodriguez himself expressed it best in one of the final entries in his Rio Negro journal, written during the long journey back to Manaus. I have spent my life in pursuit of knowledge, believing that the natural world yields its secrets to patient observation and scientific method. But the river has taught me humility. It has shown me that the world is still larger than our understanding, still capable of containing wonders that resist our attempts at classification and capture. Whether the serpent we encounter will ever be recognized by science, I cannot say, but I know this. In those dark waters, in the depths beyond the reach of sunlight, there are mysteries still, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the world needs its unknown places, its legends that might be true, its spaces where human knowledge has not yet penetrated. We went into the Rio Negro as conquerors of knowledge, determined to map and measure and understand. We emerged as humbled witnesses to something greater than ourselves. If I never see another giant serpent, if the creature passes from the world unacknowledged by science, I will still count myself privileged to have glimpsed, for a brief moment, a wonder beyond naming. Today, the legend of the giant serpent lives on in the communities along the Rio Negro. Fishermen still trade stories of unusual sightings. Indigenous elders still teach their children about Moa Grande and the respected demands. Tour guides still point out the deep, dark pools where something enormous might lurk. And sometimes, very rarely, someone reports seeing something that defies easy explanation. A wake too large for any known creature, eyes glowing in the darkness, coils breaking the surface for just a moment before disappearing into the depths. The scientific debate continues, but for those who have seen it, truly seen it, there is no debate. Colonel Antonio Rodriguez went to his grave in 1882, maintaining to the end that the serpent was real. His journals remain in the museum archive, yellow with age but still detailed, still compelling, still raising questions that we cannot answer. And in the black waters of the Rio Negro, in the deep channels where sunlight does not penetrate, perhaps the giant serpent still swims, ancient, enormous, unknowable. A reminder that for all our technology and all our knowledge, the Earth still keeps some secrets. Some mysteries endure. The legend continues, waiting for the day when someone finally brings back proof that the world cannot deny. Until then, the giant serpent of the Rio Negro exists in that fascinating space between myth and reality, between what we know and what we wonder. And perhaps that is exactly where it should remain.